April 13th of the year 1991, Bay 29th Street, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, 7:45 in the evening. The light was fading over South Brooklyn in the particular way it fades in April. Not dark yet, but no longer fully day. The kind of light that makes distances difficult to judge and shadows difficult to read. A large man came out of his house and walked toward his Lincoln Town car parked in the driveway. He was 47 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, 230 pounds of South Brooklyn muscle that had been in the service of one organization or another since he was a teenager on streets that did not reward softness. He had survived things that had killed better men. He had survived shootings. He had survived arrests. He had survived the internal politics of American organized crime during one of its most violent decades, a period in which men he had known personally had been killed by people they trusted in places they considered safe at moments they had not anticipated. He had navigated all of it. He had come through it intact and operational and connected to the most powerful figure in American organized crime at the moment of that figure's maximum ascendancy. He was 6 feet from his car when he heard footsteps behind him. He never heard the shots. Frank Lastarino stepped out of the shadow with a 380 automatic and did not stop firing until the magazine was empty. 2 rounds to the head, 5 to the torso, 7 shots in the time it takes to cross a driveway. Bobby Borriello dropped beside his own car on his own street in front of his own house and bled out on the asphalt while his 2-year-old son sat in the kitchen inside, and his wife Susan came running out of the front door to find her husband of 17 years face down in the driveway with 7 holes in him. The paramedics arrived within minutes. There was nothing they could do. Bobby Borriello was pronounced dead at the scene. This was not just another mob killing in a city that had seen more of them than any city in the country. Bobby Borriello was John Gotti's man, his driver, his bodyguard, his closest personal protector across a decade in which Gotti had made himself the most famous and most closely surveilled organized crime figure in American history. If you wanted to get to the Dapper Don, if you wanted to reach the man who had orchestrated the murder of Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse and had walked away from 3 consecutive federal prosecutions and had given himself the most recognizable public profile of any mob boss since Al Capone, you had to get through Bobby Borriello first. And everyone in New York knew it. So when Bobby went down in that driveway on a Tuesday evening in April of the year 1991, the question that moved through the underworld in the hours that followed was not whether someone had been bold enough to do it. The question was who had been powerful enough, connected enough, and sufficiently insulated from the consequences to authorize it. The newspapers got it wrong. The street rumor that circulated for years got it wrong. The version most people who knew about the killing believed for over a decade got it wrong. The real story involves something that had never occurred in the entire documented history of American organized crime. A murder arranged using 2 active-duty New York City Police Department detectives as the hired scouts who confirmed the target's location before the shooter was dispatched. This is that story. Bobby Borriello was born on March 31st of the year 1944 in South Brooklyn, not the neighborhood that word conjures today, with its renovated brownstones and wine bars and young professionals pushing strollers along streets that their grandparents would not have recognized. The South Brooklyn of the 1940s and 50s was a place where neighborhood boundaries were drawn in blood and maintained through violence, and where the men who commanded the most respect on any given block were not the men with legitimate employment and civic standing. They were the men with money and muscle and the organizational connections that gave both of those things their staying power. The Gambino family had roots there. The Genovese family had roots there. The Colombo family had roots there. The social clubs and the parishes and the specific geography of South Brooklyn in the post-war years were organized crime territory in the most literal sense, not adjacent to it, not influenced by it, but constitutive of it, in a way that meant a kid growing up on those streets in the 1950s was absorbing a specific set of values and a specific set of possibilities from the environment before he was old enough to make any conscious choice about what to do with them. Bobby Borriello absorbed them the way everyone in that environment did. His younger brother Stevie was tight with the Gallo brothers, Joey, Crazy Joe Gallo, Albert, and the crew that ran rackets out of Carroll Gardens and Red Hook. These were serious men, violent men, men whose names appeared in police files and federal intelligence reports with a frequency that reflected the specific weight of their presence in the South Brooklyn criminal ecosystem. Bobby was the bigger and physically more imposing of the two brothers. He gravitated naturally toward the enforcer's role in the way that large, physically capable men in that environment often did not, because the decision was made consciously or because a specific invitation was extended, but because the environment recognized the asset and put it to use. He became feared on the streets before he was formally associated with any family. By his early 20s, he was working as muscle for the Gallo crew. Between the year 1967 and the year 1972, he was arrested 6 times: weapons possession, assault, larceny, gambling. The police knew exactly who he was and what function he served. Knowing and proving were 2 different things in South Brooklyn. And Bobby Borriello kept walking out of precinct houses and back onto the street with the particular regularity of a man whose utility to the people around him made his continued freedom a priority worth maintaining. When Crazy Joe Gallo was shot dead at Umberto's Clam House on April 7th of the year 1972, killed over a dispute that had been building since before most of the men in the room that night had their first legitimate job, the Gallo crew's power began to fracture in the specific way that power always fractures when the person at its center is suddenly removed. Stevie Borriello worked to preserve what rackets he could in South Brooklyn. Bobby was drifting in a different direction toward a different organization, toward the Gambino family, the most powerful organized crime operation in the United States, and toward a specific man within that organization whose trajectory was beginning to intersect with Bobby's own in ways that would define the remainder of both their lives. The man who changed everything. John Gotti was coming up at the same time through the same streets in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Gotti was a capo running operations out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. He was not yet the boss. He was not yet the public figure whose photograph appeared in tabloids and whose acquittals generated headlines and whose wardrobe was discussed in the same breath as his criminal record. He was a rising figure inside the Gambino family, a man whose profile within the organization was growing with the specific momentum of someone who understood how power worked and was moving toward it with a patience, deliberateness that the people around him were beginning to recognize as something different from ordinary ambition. He was exactly the kind of boss that a man like Bobby Borriello could respect. Gotti dressed well. He spoke precisely. He rewarded loyalty with a consistency that was not universal in the world they both inhabited. He punished disloyalty with an equal consistency that was understood by everyone in his orbit as a feature rather than a flaw. He ran a tight operation, and he expected the people around him to run tight alongside him. Somewhere in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the precise moment is not documented with the specificity that would make it definitive. Bobby Borriello became Gotti's man. Not just another associate in a large organizational network, not just a soldier available for assignment when the operational requirements of the crew demanded it. Bobby became Gotti's driver and his personal bodyguard, the man sitting in the front seat of the car, the man who got out first when the vehicle stopped, the man who stood between the boss and whatever was waiting outside the door. That position carries specific implications in the world of organized crime that are not always fully appreciated from the outside. To be a boss's personal protector is to be trusted completely, because you cannot perform the function with anything less than complete trust, and because any breach of that trust has consequences that are immediate and irreversible. You know everything because you are everywhere. You are present for conversations that are not repeated. You observe decisions that are not documented. You understand the architecture of the organization's operations at a level of detail that most people inside it never achieve, because most people inside it are not present at the moments when the architecture is most clearly visible. You are also permanently linked to the boss's fate in ways that cannot be undone, regardless of what subsequently happens to either of you. Bobby and Gotti spent weekends together on Long Island. They gambled together. They attended performances by singer Jay Black, a childhood friend of Gotti's, and were photographed together dozens of times by FBI surveillance teams who made careers out of cataloging the Gambino family's social arrangements. Bobby was not an employee in any meaningful sense of the word. He was, in the fullest sense available to men in that world, a friend. In the year 1988, specifically on December 24th of that year, in an apartment on Mulberry Street in Manhattan in the home of Joe Butch, Corral's mother, Bobby Borriello, was formally inducted into the Gambino crime family. The men led into that apartment that evening represented the organizational hierarchy of the family at one of the peak moments of its institutional power. John Gotti Jr., Dominic Pizzonia, Craig De Palma, Nicholas Lascorsa. The oath was administered by Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano and Pasquale Conte. Being made in the Gambino family in the late 1980s with Gotti as boss was not a bureaucratic formality. It was an arrival at the center of the most powerful organized crime operation in the United States at the moment of that operation's maximum reach and maximum vulnerability, a combination that would prove in the years that immediately followed to be more significant than anyone in that apartment on Mulberry Street fully appreciated on the night it was constituted, how he actually operated. Bobby Borriello's proximity to Gotti was the most visible element of his criminal profile. It was not the only element. His crew ran trucking operations, construction rackets, and loan sharking across Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, and South Brooklyn. A geographic footprint that reflected the organizational reach of the Gambino family at the height of its influence, and the specific ambition of a man who understood that the protection of Gotti's proximity was an asset to be leveraged across as many revenue streams as the operational capacity of the crew could support. He associated with serious men, Angelo Paccioni, Anthony Anastasio. The crew had a significant stake in strip clubs along the East Coast through a businessman named Steve Kaplan, who paid tribute to both Bobby and Gotti's son, Jr., for the privilege of operating without interference from the organizational infrastructure that controlled the territory those clubs occupied. The operation generated serious money. Bobby was aggressive about protecting it in ways that occasionally exceeded the operational boundaries that even the Gambino family's tolerance was designed to accommodate. On one occasion, he opened fire on a Genovese associate named Preston Garitano in broad daylight on a Brooklyn street, the kind of action that, had anyone other than Gotti's personal bodyguard committed it, would have produced consequences that were immediate and final. Bobby had enough organizational weight behind him that the families negotiated a settlement rather than escalate to a conflict that would have cost both sides more than the original incident warranted. Then came October 4th of the year 1990. A Gambino family soldier named Louis Dono had secured a lucrative contract to install fireproofing foam on the infrastructure of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. That contract represented serious money, the kind of institutional construction revenue that the Gambino family had been extracting from the New York building industry for decades through a combination of union control and organized extortion that the FBI had been documenting without being able to fully prosecute. Dono had been dodging Gotti's summons. He had been refusing to come in and account for himself and for the money his contract was generating, a refusal that, in the organizational framework Gotti operated within, constituted a specific and unambiguous form of disrespect that had one available response. Gotti gave the contract to Bobby. Louis Dono was shot dead on October 4th of the year 1990 in a parking garage at the World Trade Center. Sammy Gravano subsequently took over the construction business. The operation functioned exactly as designed. One man removed, the money redirected. Nobody asked questions about a transfer of operational control that has been accomplished through violence, because asking questions about it would require acknowledging what the violence was for. By late 1990, Bobby Borriello had been elevated to acting capo of Junior Gotti's crew. He was running his rackets from a social club on Sackett Street in Brooklyn. He was one of the most operationally significant figures in the Gambino family at the precise moment when the family's leadership was about to be removed from the street. In December of the year 1990, John Gotti was indicted on federal charges and taken into custody. He established a 5-man ruling panel to manage the family's operations while he fought his case. Junior Gotti was on that panel. Bobby Borriello, as acting capo, held a position of real operational authority in a family whose boss was behind bars and whose future was being determined by the specific quality of the men left outside to manage it. On the surface, this was the peak. 47 years old, a made capo in the most powerful crime family in the country. Gotti's personal protector, elevated to one of the family's operational leaders during a period of institutional crisis that demanded exactly the kind of reliable, trusted, capable management that Bobby had spent his entire adult life demonstrating he could provide. Beneath that surface, something had been building for 6 years that Bobby had no way of fully seeing, and that no one in the Gambino family's orbit had the specific intelligence to warn him about. The man with the list. On December 16th of the year 1985, Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti were shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan during the evening rush hour. The hit was orchestrated by John Gotti. It was executed with a precision and a logistical complexity that reflected months of planning and the involvement of multiple personnel across different organizational levels. 3 separate hit teams, coordinated timing, no arrests on the night. It was a brilliant and audacious act of criminal violence. It was also entirely unsanctioned. No vote by the commission, no authorization from the organizational hierarchy that was supposed to govern decisions of that magnitude. Gotti killed the boss of the Gambino family and installed himself as successor, because the specific combination of opportunity and capability had aligned in a way that made it possible, and because he had assessed the institutional consequences of acting without authorization as acceptable relative to the institutional consequences of not acting. Some of the other New York families did not share that assessment. The Lucchese family had been closely aligned with Castellano. Their underboss, Anthony Gaspipe Casso, did not view the Sparks hit as an acceptable exercise of organizational authority. He viewed it as a theft, and a Gambino informant named Dominic LaFaro later identified Bobby Borriello as one of the men involved in the Castellano operation, present in some capacity in the machinery that had produced the murder of a boss that Casso had considered an ally. Casso had a list. Bobby Borriello was on it. You have to understand who Casso was to understand what being on that list meant. Anthony Salvatore Casso was born May 21st of the year 1942 in South Brooklyn, the same neighborhood that had produced Bobby Borriello, the same streets, the same parishes, the same organizational ecosystem. He was, by any serious accounting, the most systematically homicidal figure in the New York mob during the 1980s. He ordered murders with a frequency and a casualness that distinguished him even within an environment where ordering murders was a recognized and accepted management tool. He was eventually charged with 15 murders and pleaded guilty to racketeering, extortion, and murder while cooperating with the government. Prosecutors estimated his actual body count at something closer to 100. Casso did not want to win his conflicts. He wanted the people on the other side of them to stop existing entirely. And by the late 1980s, Casso had developed a capability for pursuing that objective that no other figure in the history of American organized crime had ever possessed. He had 2 New York City Police Department detectives on his payroll, the men who were supposed to protect the city. Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa were active duty detectives with the New York City Police Department. Ippolito was physically imposing, a former bodybuilder who had written a book about his own family's mob connections, which should have ended his law enforcement career and instead somehow did not. Caracappa was quieter and more methodical, the kind of investigator who built his career inside major case squads, tracking organized crime, homicides, which gave him access to exactly the kind of intelligence that a man like Casso needed. By any external assessment, they were serious police officers. They carried badges and weapons and the institutional authority of one of the largest law enforcement organizations in the world. And they were assigned to cases involving the very criminal networks they were simultaneously serving. They were on Anthony Casso's payroll at $4,000 per month each. Starting around the year 1986, Ippolito and Caracappa began feeding Casso confidential NYPD intelligence. They pulled files from the department's organized crime databases. They identified informants whose cooperation with law enforcement was exposing Casso's operations. They provided home addresses and vehicle registrations for individuals Casso wanted located. They facilitated multiple murders by providing the target intelligence that made those murders operationally possible. Casso used them the way a military commander uses reconnaissance assets. Find the target, confirm the location, deliver the intelligence to the people who will act on it, let the shooters do the rest. By early 1991, Casso had decided that Bobby Borriello needed to be removed. The trigger was an audio recording. Ippolito and Caracappa had provided Casso with a cassette tape on which Bobby Borriello could be heard making explicit threats against Casso and his family. The specific origin of the recording, whether it was produced through official NYPD surveillance or through some other mechanism, has been disputed across the various legal proceedings that subsequently examined it. What was not disputed was its content. Bobby had said things on that tape that Casso treated as a formal declaration of intent requiring a formal response. The response required confirmation of Bobby's current address. Ippolito took on that function. Personally, he needed to verify that the Borriello family had actually moved into their new home in Bensonhurst. He drove to Bay 29th Street in his detective's vehicle. He was in uniform. He walked to the front door and knocked. Susan Borriello answered. She described what happened in that doorway years later to the New York Post. A large detective pushed his jacket back to display his shield and his weapon. He asked if Bobby Borriello lived at that address. When Susan told him her husband was not home, the detective said he would come back and walked to his car and drove away. He never came back. He had everything he needed. The address was confirmed. The intelligence was delivered to Casso. The contract was placed with Lucchese Captain Frank, Big Frank Lino. Lastarino was dispatched as the shooter described in court documents as a serious operator, a man who got things done without noise or complications and who did not miss. April 13th of the year 1991, Bobby had spent the afternoon at Aqueduct Racetrack. He came home in the early evening. Susan was in the kitchen with their 2-year-old son, Bobby Jr. Their 11-year-old Patrick was at the movies. Bobby stepped out of his Lincoln Town car and began walking toward the house. That was when Lastarino came out of the shadow. 7 rounds. 2 to the head, 5 to the torso. Bobby Borriello went down beside his car and did not get up. Susan heard noise from inside the house. She thought it was another argument with the neighbor about the driveway, a dispute that had happened a dozen times before, loud enough to hear from the kitchen, but not serious enough to require intervention. She walked outside. She saw her husband face down on the asphalt. She picked up Bobby Jr. She called the police. She collapsed when they told her he was dead. Gotti received the news in jail. He was furious in the specific way that a man who has lost the person he trusted most with his own physical safety can be furious. Not the calculated anger of an organizational response to a competitive threat, but something more personal and more immediate than that. He sent word that Stevie Borriello, Bobby's brother, had his full authorization and the full backing of the Gambino family to pursue whatever response Stevie determined was appropriate. He also ordered family representatives to meet with the Genovese leadership about Garitano, the man Bobby had shot at years earlier, wanting every potential loose end identified and addressed. For 14 years, nobody could tell Susan Borriello who had done it or why. The men who came to investigate the murder they had helped arrange, that changed in March of the year 2005. DEA and FBI agents arrested Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa in Las Vegas, Nevada, where both men had retired and were living the comfortable and unexamined lives of former law enforcement officers whose pensions and post-service arrangements reflected nothing of what they had done during their active careers. The federal indictment against them was one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of American law enforcement. 8 murders, 2 attempted murders, murder conspiracy, obstruction of justice, drug distribution, money laundering. The 2 detectives who had been paid by the city of New York to protect its citizens had spent a decade operating as contract killers and intelligence assets for the Lucchese crime family. Bobby Borriello's murder was named in the original indictment. Prosecutors documented in specific detail how Ippolito and Caracappa had accepted the contract to locate Borriello, had confirmed his address through the specific and documented mechanism of Ippolito knocking on Susan's door in uniform, and had delivered that confirmation to Casso in a form that enabled the shooting. For trial purposes, prosecutors subsequently pared down the charges, and the Borriello murder was not among the counts taken to verdict. But the evidentiary record documenting the detective's role in setting up the hit was established in federal court filings and confirmed through the testimony of cooperating witnesses whose knowledge of the arrangement was direct, specific. Susan Borriello found out what had happened in the year 2005, 14 years after burying her husband. When Ippolito's photograph appeared in the newspaper coverage of the arrests, she recognized him immediately, the large detective who had come to her door, who had pushed his jacket back to show his badge and his gun, and asked if her husband was home, and told her he would be back and driven away with what he had actually come for. She called prosecutors and told them what she had seen. Her father, who had been present on the night of the killing and had been questioned by investigators at the crime scene in the hours after Bobby's death, recognized Caracappa as one of the detectives who had questioned him that night. The men who came to investigate the murder of Bobby Borriello were the men who had provided the intelligence that made the murder possible. What happened to the men responsible? Ippolito and Caracappa were convicted on all counts. In the year 2006, United States District Judge Jack Weinstein sentenced both men to life in federal prison plus 80 years and fined each of them more than $4 million. The sentencing reflected both the severity of what they had done and the particular institutional damage that police officers who operate as organized crime assets inflict on the systems of trust and accountability that law enforcement depends on. Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the man who had ordered the hit, who had maintained Ippolito and Caracappa on his payroll, who had used them as the reconnaissance infrastructure for multiple murders across a decade of organized violence, had turned federal informant in the year 1994. He eventually pleaded guilty to 70 separate crimes, including racketeering, extortion, and 15 murders. A federal judge sentenced him to 455 years in federal prison. He died in custody on December 15th of the year 2020. Frank Lastarino, the man who had stepped out of the shadow on Bay 29th Street and fired 7 rounds into Bobby Borriello in a driveway in Bensonhurst, eventually pleaded guilty to multiple murders and racketeering charges. He did not die in that driveway. He died on a plea agreement in a federal proceeding years later, which is a different kind of ending and a considerably less dramatic one than the ending he delivered to Bobby Borriello on a Tuesday evening in April of the year 1991. Stevie Borriello remained active in the Gambino family in Brooklyn and Staten Island for years after his brother's death. The permission Gotti had granted him to pursue consequences was real, but the specific form those consequences took is not fully documented in the available record. John Gotti was convicted on April 2nd of the year 1992 on 5 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, tax evasion, illegal gambling, and extortion. He received a sentence of life in federal prison with no possibility of parole. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in the year 1998 and died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, on June 10th of the year 2002. He was 61 years old. He never walked free after the conviction. Bobby Borriello is buried in a cemetery in Brooklyn. He was 47 years old when he died in that driveway. His 2-year-old son was in the kitchen. His 11-year-old son was at the movies. His wife was inside the house, thinking the noise she heard was a neighbor arguing about a parking space. The detective who knocked on her door to confirm the address was on the City of New York's payroll the morning he knocked on it. He was on Anthony Casso's payroll the afternoon he drove away from it. That is the detail that separates this story from every other mob killing in the documented history of American organized crime. Not the violence. The violence was ordinary in the specific world it inhabited. The specific, unprecedented, formally documented fact that the scouts who located the target for the shooter were active duty detectives of the New York City Police Department, using the institutional resources and the organizational authority of that department to facilitate the murder of a man whose killing had been ordered by the underboss of a rival crime family. It had never happened before in the documented record. It has never happened since. Susan Borriello waited 14 years to find out who had knocked on her door. And the answer, when it came, was the one answer that no one in the entire history of the investigation had allowed themselves to fully anticipate.